Something was wrong with the ballroom. Theron Valdris stood at the head of the great hall, his hand tight around a goblet he had not touched, and stared out across a sea of faces he did not care about. The Ashenmore Autumn Ball was in full display. Candles blazed in iron chandeliers overhead. Music swelled from the gallery. Hundreds of wolves in their finest attire danced, laughed, schemed, and performed for one another the way they always did at these events. Everything was exactly as it should be. And yet, something was missing. The wrongness had started the moment he stepped through the doors. A low, nagging itch at the base of his skull. A restlessness beneath his ribs that had nothing to do with the wine and everything to do with a feeling he could not name. His wolf had been pacing inside him since sundown, agitated, circling, pressing against his chest like it wanted to claw its way out. Theron scanned the crowd again. Every face was familiar. Every noble house accounted for. His beta, Dashiell, had confirmed the guest list twice. Everyone was here. So why did the room feel hollow? He shifted his weight. His jaw tightened. He scanned the east wall, then the west. The clusters near the wine tables. The couples on the dance floor. He was looking for someone. The realization hit him like a blow to the sternum, sharp and disorienting. He was looking for someone specific, and he had no idea who. His wolf surged forward, hard enough that Theron had to grip the edge of the table to keep his composure. His claws threatened to extend. His vision sharpened against his will, every color in the room brightening to an almost painful intensity. A low growl built in the back of his throat, and the two nobles nearest to him took an involuntary step away, their faces draining of color. The Alpha King did not growl at social functions. The Alpha King stood at the head of the room like a statue carved from stone and power, and the court arranged itself around him accordingly. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. But tonight, the statue was cracking. Dashiell appeared at his elbow, his expression carefully neutral in the way that meant he had noticed something concerning. "You have been staring at the crowd for 20 minutes, Your Majesty," the beta said quietly. "Is there a threat?" "No," Theron said. A pause. "Is there a person?" Theron turned his head slowly and fixed his beta with a look that would have made most wolves take a step backward. Dashiell did not step backward. He never did. It was both his most useful and most infuriating quality. "I do not know," Theron admitted, and the words tasted strange in his mouth. He was the Alpha King of Ashenmore. He did not say things like, "I do not know." He said things like, "Bring them to me and the matter is settled, and you have until dawn." But tonight the Alpha King of Ashenmore was standing in his own ballroom, surrounded by 700 wolves, searching for a face he could not remember, and aching for a presence he had never consciously registered. His chest hurt, not metaphorically. An actual, physical pressure behind his ribs, as though something vital had been removed, and his body was only now noticing the wound. He pressed the heel of his hand against his sternum and felt his wolf lunge again, snarling, frantic, clawing at the inside of his skull with a desperation that bordered on madness. Something was wrong. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong, and every wolf in this room was the wrong wolf. Every single one of them. "Get me the attendance record," Theron said. Dashiell's eyebrow rose a fraction. "For tonight? For every ball, every gathering, every formal event held in this hall for the past 3 years." The beta stared at him for a beat too long, then left without another word. Theron turned back to the crowd. The music played on. The candles flickered in their iron cages. Somewhere to his left, a countess laughed too loudly at a joke that was not funny. Everything was the same as it had always been, except it was not. Something had shifted, something fundamental and irreversible, and Theron could feel it in his bones the way he could feel a storm before the first crack of thunder. His wolf howled inside him, low and long and devastated. Someone was supposed to be here. Someone who had always been here. And tonight, for the first time, they were gone. He set the untouched goblet down on the table, his hand trembling slightly, and walked into the crowd to search for a ghost he could not name. He searched for 2 hours. He moved through the hall like a predator without prey, cutting through clusters of conversation, his gaze sweeping every corner, every shadow, every face. Wolves parted for him without understanding why he was moving among them. He did not understand either. He did not find her. 3 weeks earlier, Elowen Thorne had made a decision that felt, at the time, like the smallest act of self-preservation imaginable. She was not going to the autumn ball. It was not dramatic. It was not a protest. It was simply the quiet, private conclusion of a woman who had spent year after year standing in a room full of people and being seen by none of them. Elowen was a chandler. She made candles for the Ashenmore pack, which sounded humble because it was humble. She worked in a stone workshop at the eastern edge of the palace grounds, surrounded by blocks of beeswax and tallow and rows of hanging wicks. Her hands always smelled of lavender and rendered fat, no matter how many times she scrubbed them. Her hair perpetually carried the faint sweetness of melted wax. She was 23 years old, unmated, unremarkable, and invisible. That last part was not self-pity. It was an observation. Elowen had spent her entire life being the kind of person that other people's eyes simply slid over. Not ugly, not pretty, not loud, not interesting. Just present, just there. A background figure in everyone else's story. She had been left at the pack gates as an infant, wrapped in a plain wool blanket with no note, no name, no explanation. The pack had taken her in because that was what packs did, but she had never belonged to anyone in particular. She was raised communally, which sounded warmer than it was. In practice, it meant she was everyone's responsibility and no one's priority. By the time she was old enough to understand the difference, the lesson had already settled into her bones. She did not take up space. She did not make demands. She existed quietly at the margins and made herself useful, because useful was the closest thing to wanted that she had ever known. The balls were the worst of it. Every pack member of age was expected to attend the seasonal gatherings. 4 times a year, Elowen put on the nicest dress she owned, which was the same dress every time because chandlers did not earn enough to own more than one, walked into the great hall, and stood near the back wall for 3 hours. She did not dance because no one asked her. She did not mingle because no one noticed her. And she watched the king. She could not help it. There on Valdris was impossible not to watch. He was tall in a way that had nothing to do with height, and everything to do with the way a room rearranged itself around him. When he entered, conversation shifted. Bodies turned. The air itself seemed to tighten, charged with something electric and ancient and dangerous. He had dark hair, sharp features, and gray eyes that could pin a man in place from across a crowded hall. Elowen had seen him reduce a visiting alpha to stammering silence with nothing more than a look. She had watched him command a room of 200 wolves without raising his voice above a murmur. And in 3 years, across 12 seasonal balls, he had never once looked at her. Not a glance, not a flicker of acknowledgement, not even the idle sweep of a gaze that happened to pass through the space she occupied. She was nothing to him, less than nothing. She was furniture. The worst part was the pull. It had started during the very first ball, a subtle tug in her chest whenever his gaze swept the room, a breathless tightening whenever his voice carried across the hall. She had told herself it was admiration. Then she had told herself it was infatuation. Then she had stopped telling herself anything at all and simply endured it. The private, pointless ache of wanting someone who would never know her name. "You are going to the ball." her friend Calla said on the morning of the autumn gathering, leaning in the doorway of the candle workshop with a meat pie in one hand and absolute certainty in her voice. I am not, Elowen replied, dipping a wick into melted beeswax without looking up. You say this every season. And every season I go anyway, and every season I stand against a wall like a decorative sconce and watch other people have lives. Not this time. Calla bit into the pie and chewed thoughtfully. Is this about the king? Elowen's hand jerked. Wax splattered across the workbench. No. Because staring at someone for 3 years and then dramatically refusing to attend the one event where you might actually speak to him seems very much like it is about the king. I have never spoken to the king, Elowen said, her voice flat. I will never speak to the king. The king does not know I exist. The king has looked directly through me on at least 4 separate occasions as though I were made of glass. I am not being dramatic. I am being practical. You are being sad, Calla corrected gently. Elowen stopped dipping the wick. She stared at the cooling wax, at the way it hardened in thin, pale layers, building up slowly over time until the candle took shape. Maybe, she admitted, but I am tired of being sad in a ballroom. I would rather be sad at home where the lighting is better and no one is wearing perfume that makes me sneeze. Calla opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. Something in Elowen's expression must have told her this was not a battle worth fighting. Fine, Calla said softly, but you are going to regret it. Elowen did not think she would. The night of the ball, she stayed in her small room above the workshop. She made tea. She read a book about the medicinal properties of wildflowers, which was the most exciting literature available to a Chandler on a Chandler's budget. She went to bed early and slept more soundly than she had in months, unburdened for the first time by the weight of expectation and disappointment. She did not know that across the palace grounds, the Alpha King of Ashenmore was tearing through a crowded ballroom, searching for something he could not find. She did not know his hands were shaking. She did not know that when Dashiell brought him the attendance records the following morning, the king would sit at his desk for 4 hours, comparing every name across every guest list the palace had on record, cross-referencing each entry, eliminating them one by one until a single name remained. She did not know that he would find it. She did not know that he would read her name, Elowen Thorne, Chandler, Eastern Workshop, and feel his wolf slam against his ribs so hard it left him breathless. And she certainly did not know that by the time the sun set that day, a royal summons would arrive at her workshop door. The summons arrived on cream-colored paper, sealed with the Valdris crest in black wax. Elowen stared at it for a long time. Her hands did not shake, which surprised her, because the rest of her was shaking badly enough to compensate. The wording was formal, clipped, and devoid of warmth. Miss Elowen Thorne, your presence is requested at the palace this afternoon, by order of His Majesty, King Theron Valdris. No explanation, no context, no hint of why the most powerful wolf in the realm had suddenly become aware that a candlemaker existed. He found my name on the list, she thought. He compared the lists and found the missing name, and it was mine. But that made no sense. Why would the king care about one absent Chandler? She was nobody. She made candles. She smelled like beeswax. There was nothing about her absence that should register as anything more than a minor administrative irregularity, unless she was in trouble. The thought landed in her stomach like a stone. Was attendance at the balls mandatory in the legal sense? Had she broken some obscure pack law by staying home? Was there a fine? Was there a punishment? She imagined being hauled before the king and sentenced to hard labor for the crime of not wanting to stand against a wall for 3 hours. The mental image was so absurd she almost laughed. Almost. Elowen arrived at the palace with wax beneath her fingernails and the faint scent of lavender clinging to her hair. A guard led her through corridors she had never walked, past rooms she had never seen, deeper into the palace than a Chandler had any reason to go. They stopped at a heavy oak door. The guard knocked once and stepped aside. "Enter," said a voice from within. Not the king's. Calmer, more measured. The beta, Dashiell, stood behind a writing desk in a room lined with maps. He was lean and sharp-featured, the kind of man who noticed everything and revealed nothing. He studied her with an expression that gave away absolutely nothing about what was happening or why she was here. "Miss Thorne," he said. "Thank you for coming." "I did not realize I had a choice," Elowen replied. Something flickered behind his eyes. Not quite amusement, but close. "You did not," he confirmed. "Please sit." She sat. The chair was uncomfortable, which felt appropriate. "You were absent from the autumn ball," Dashiell said. "I was." "May I ask why?" Elowen hesitated. Because I was tired of being invisible did not seem like the kind of answer one gave to the Alpha King's second in command. "I was unwell," she said. "You were not," Dashiell replied without missing a beat. "The infirmary has no record of illness. Your workshop neighbor confirmed you were in good health the day prior and the day after." He had checked. Someone had actually investigated her absence like it was a matter of state security. Elowen felt a chill crawl down her spine. "Why does it matter?" she asked, her voice smaller than she intended. Dashiell leaned forward, his hands folded on the desk. "Because the night you did not attend, the king experienced a physical and psychological episode unlike anything since his coronation. He became agitated. His wolf surfaced in a public setting. He could not identify the source of his distress, but he was convinced something essential was missing from the hall." Elowen stared at him. "And you think that something was me?" "I think the timing is notable," Dashiell said carefully. "With respect, my lord, the king does not know who I am. He has never looked at me. Not once." "Yes," Dashiell agreed. "That is also notable." The words hung between them, strange and heavy with implication. Before Elowen could respond, Dashiell rose from his chair. "The king wishes to meet you." Her heart slammed against her ribs. "Now?" "Now. I have wax under my fingernails. I do not think he will mind." "I mind," Elowen said, but Dashiell was already moving toward the door, and she had no choice but to follow on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. The walk was long. The corridors narrowed, then widened. Guards stood at intervals, their faces blank. Elowen counted her steps because counting kept her breathing steady, and breathing was the only thing she had control over in this moment. Dashiell stopped at a set of double doors. Carved wolves ran along the frame, frozen mid-stride in dark wood. "I should tell you," Dashiell said quietly, his hand on the door, "that the king has not been sleeping. Not since the ball. His condition has been deteriorating rapidly." "His condition?" The beta did not elaborate. He pushed the door open and gestured her inside. The king's study was enormous, dimly lit by a single window that seemed to fight a losing battle against the shadows. And behind the desk, sitting in a chair that looked more like a throne, was Theron Valdris. He looked terrible. Elowen had only ever seen him from across a ballroom, gilded by candlelight, commanding and untouchable. Up close, the illusion crumbled. His skin was pale, almost gray. The hollows beneath his eyes were deep enough to hold shadows. His cheekbones stood out too sharply, and his hands, resting on the arms of his chair, had a slight tremor that he was clearly trying to suppress. He looked like a man who had not slept in 3 weeks, because he had not. And then he looked at her. His gray eyes locked onto hers, and Elowen felt it like a physical collision, something slamming into her chest and stealing every ounce of breath from her lungs. The room contracted. The shadows deepened. For a single, suspended heartbeat, the world contained nothing but him and her, and the raw, bewildered recognition in his gaze. Then it was gone. His expression shuttered. His mouth pressed into a hard line. He looked away, his knuckles whitening on the arm of his chair, and the dismissal was so swift and so total that Eowyn felt it like a door slamming in her face. "Leave us," Theron said to Dashel, his voice rough and strained. The beta left, the door closed, and Eowyn stood alone in a room with a king who looked like he was falling apart and who had, for one fraction of 1 second, looked at her like she was the answer to every question he had ever asked. Then he spoke, and the words turned her blood to ice. "What have you done to me?" Eowyn stared at him. "What?" "3 years," Theron said, and his voice was low and controlled in a way that suggested the control was costing him everything he had. "You have attended every gathering for 3 years. I confirmed it myself. 12 seasonal balls. Your name on every list. And I have no memory of your face." He stood slowly, bracing one hand on the desk. She could see the effort it took, the way his muscles locked to compensate for the exhaustion pulling at him. "That is not possible," he continued. "I remember every face in my territory. I am the alpha. I know my wolves. And yet you—" His gaze swept over her, searching, almost desperate. "You are a complete stranger to me. You have existed within arm's reach since my coronation, and I have never once seen you." "With all respect, Your Majesty," Eowyn said, her voice steadier than it had any right to be, "I am a chandler. People do not generally notice candle makers." "I notice everyone. You did not notice me." The words came out sharper than she intended, carrying years of accumulated hurt in their edges. Theron's eyes narrowed and she braced herself for anger. Kings did not appreciate being spoken to like that. But the anger did not come. Instead, something shifted in his expression, something that looked uncomfortably like guilt. "No," he admitted. "I did not." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Eowyn clasped her hands in front of her to keep them from trembling. "Your beta tells me you have not been sleeping," she said. Theron's jaw clenched. "My beta talks too much. He said it started the night I did not attend the ball." "It started before that," Theron said, and then stopped, as though he had not meant to say that out loud. He turned away from her, moving toward the window. The gray light fell across his face and made the hollows beneath his eyes look deeper, like bruises. "There have been episodes," he said after a moment, his back to her. "For months, stretches of nights where sleep comes only in fragments, where my wolf is restless, where I feel as though I am forgetting something critical. But it was manageable." He paused. "Until you stopped coming." Eowyn felt her pulse hammering in her throat. "I do not understand how my presence at a ball has anything to do with whether you sleep." "Neither do I," Theron said, and the frustration in his voice was raw. "I have had Marin, the royal healer, examining me for weeks. She found nothing she can prove, nothing in my blood, nothing in my wolf. No poison, no illness, no explanation that holds up under scrutiny. And then, the beta cross-referenced the timing and found my name," Eowyn said. "Yes. So what happens now? You want me to come to the next ball and stand against the back wall in my one good dress and see if you magically feel better?" She had not meant it to come out bitter, but years of invisibility had left a residue that she could not quite scrub away, and being summoned to the palace like a medical curiosity rather than a person had ground against something raw inside her. Theron turned from the window and looked at her. Really looked at her. And this time he did not look away. His gaze moved across her face with a slow, deliberate intensity that made her skin flush and her stomach tighten. "It is not about the ball," he said quietly. Eowyn's breath caught. "What do you mean?" "Marin wants to run a test," he said. "She wants to monitor my vitals while you are present and compare them to when you are not. She believes there may be a proximity component to whatever is happening." "A proximity component," Elowen repeated flatly. You mean you want me to sit near you and see if it fixes you? That is a crude, but accurate summary, yes. Elowen crossed her arms. The gesture was mostly to keep herself from shaking. She was standing in the Alpha King's private study, being asked to serve as some kind of therapeutic presence, and the absurdity of it warred with something else entirely. Because beneath the exhaustion and the clinical detachment, Theron Valdris was looking at her the way no one had ever looked at her in her entire life. Like she mattered. Like her existence carried weight. And she hated how much she wanted that to be real. How long? She asked. An hour, initially. And if it works? Theron hesitated. The pause was long enough that Elowen understood he had already considered this question and did not like the answer. Then we discuss longer arrangements, he said. You mean I become your medicine? His expression flickered. That is not what I said. But it is what you mean. Elowen met his gaze and held it. You do not know me. You have never known me. And now you want me here because my presence does something useful to your body. Not because I am a person. Because I am a remedy. The words landed hard. She watched them hit, watched something tighten behind his gray eyes. I understand why you would see it that way, he said. It is the only way to see it, Your Majesty. Another silence. The fire crackled in the grate. Somewhere in the corridor outside, footsteps passed and faded. Will you do it anyway? He asked. Elowen wanted to say no. Every scrap of pride she possessed was screaming at her to turn around, walk out, and go back to her workshop where she was invisible by choice rather than by arrangement. She owed this man nothing. He had looked through her for years like she was made of smoke, but she looked at the tremor in his hands, the bruised hollows under his eyes, the way he stood too carefully, as though balance was something that required concentration, and she felt something shift inside her chest. A tug, faint but undeniable, pulling her toward him like a thread wound tight between her ribs and his. She told herself it was pity. She told herself it was duty. She told herself a lot of things. Fine, she said. 1 hour. Theron exhaled slowly and something in his shoulders loosened, just barely, like a man who had been bracing for a blow that did not come. Thank you, he said. Do not thank me yet, Elowen replied. I charge extra for miracles. Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, but the faint, exhausted echo of one. It transformed him for just a moment, softening the sharp edges, making him look less like a king and more like a man who was very, very tired and very, very grateful. Then it was gone. Marin will prepare the examination room, he said. Dashiell will escort you. Elowen turned toward the door, her heart hammering, her mind already spinning with questions she did not have answers to. But before she reached it, his voice stopped her. Miss Thorne. She turned back. For what it is worth, Theron said, his gaze fixed somewhere past her shoulder, his voice rough and low. I do not understand how I failed to see you, but I see you now. The words settled into her chest like embers dropped into dry grass. She did not trust them. She could not afford to. But they burned anyway. Elowen left the room, and the door closed behind her, and she stood in the corridor with her pulse roaring in her ears, and the terrible, wonderful, dangerous knowledge that the Alpha King of Ashenmoor had just looked at her like she was the only real thing in the world, and she had absolutely no idea what that meant. The first test lasted exactly 1 hour, as promised. Marin, the royal healer, was a woman in her middle years with sharp cheekbones, sharper eyes, and the particular brand of calm that came from decades spent telling powerful people things they did not want to hear. She had prepared the examination room like a battlefield, instruments laid out on linen, monitoring crystals arranged in a careful arc around a leather armchair. Sit there, she told Theron, pointing to the chair. The king sat. He looked worse than he had 2 days ago when Elwyn had first seen him, if that was possible. The tremor in his hands had worsened. His skin had taken on a grayish tint that no amount of firelight could warm. "Miss Thorne," Marin said, gesturing to a wooden chair 6 feet from the king. "There, please." Elwyn sat. Theron did not look at her. He stared straight ahead at the far wall, his jaw set, his body rigid with a tension that radiated off him in waves. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the monitoring crystals. Nothing happened. 5 minutes passed. 10. Elwyn sat with her hands folded in her lap and tried not to stare at the king, which was like trying not to stare at a thunderstorm. Then Marin leaned forward, her brow furrowing. "Remarkable," she murmured. "What?" Theron asked. "Your pulse has dropped 14 beats since she sat down. Your cortisol levels are falling. Your wolf," she paused, checking a crystal that glowed faintly amber, "is settling for the first time in 3 weeks." The silence that followed was heavy. "How do you feel?" Marin asked Theron. A long pause. "Less," he said finally, and then stopped. "Less what?" "Less like I am being torn apart from the inside." Elwyn's chest tightened. She stared at her hands and said nothing. Over the next week, the tests expanded. 1 hour became 2. 2 became 4. By the 5th day, Elwyn was spending her afternoons in the king's study, sitting in a leather chair in the corner while he worked at his desk and pretended she was not there. It was absurd. She brought candle-making supplies to keep her hands busy, and so the Alpha King of Ashenmoor conducted affairs of state, while the faint scent of beeswax and lavender drifted through his chambers, and his chandler sat 10 feet away, braiding wicks. They did not speak much. Theron was not a man built for small talk. He communicated in terse questions, brief acknowledgments, and silences that stretched long enough to develop their own weather patterns. But slowly, painfully slowly, cracks formed. "What is that scent?" he asked one afternoon without looking up from his correspondence. "Juniper," Elwyn said. "I am testing a new taper formula." Another silence, then, "It is not unpleasant." "High praise from your majesty," Elwyn murmured. His pen paused on the page. She thought she saw the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth, but it vanished before she could be certain. On the 7th day, Marin asked Elwyn to move her chair closer to the king's desk. On the 9th day, she asked them to sit side by side. On the 11th day, she asked Elwyn to place her hand on the king's forearm. "Why?" Elwyn asked, her stomach turning over. "Because proximity alone is no longer sufficient," Marin replied. "His improvement has plateaued. Physical contact may push past the threshold." Theron said nothing. He sat in his chair with his sleeve rolled to the elbow, his forearm resting on the desk, his face utterly unreadable. The silence was an invitation and a dare. Elwyn reached out. Her fingertips touched his skin. The world detonated. It was not a metaphor. Something inside her chest cracked open like a door forced off its hinges, and through it poured a sensation so overwhelming she could not separate its parts. Warmth, recognition, hunger, grief. A terrible, aching rightness that felt like coming home to a house she had never lived in. And then, beneath all of it, something else. Something dark and coiling and wrong. Like touching a living thing that was wrapped in chains she could not see. Theron gasped. His hand shot out and gripped the edge of the desk so hard the wood groaned. His eyes went wide, unfocused, his pupils blown to black. "Your Majesty," Elwyn started, and then the vision hit her. She saw a room she did not recognize. Stone walls, candles in a circle, symbols drawn in blood on the floor. A cloaked figure knelt at the center, hands pressed flat against the cold stone, murmuring words in a language that sounded like breaking glass. And before the figure, bound and unconscious, lay Theron. Not as he was now. Younger, clean-shaven, dressed in ceremonial robes she recognized from paintings of the Ashenmore coronation. The cloaked figure reached toward him, pressing something against his chest. Dark threads, visible and writhing, sank into his skin and wrapped around his heart like a cage. His wolf, a massive silver beast visible in the spiritual plane, thrashed and howled as the threads wound tighter, binding its senses, blinding its instincts, severing its ability to recognize the one thing it was born to find. His mate. Her. The vision shattered. Elowyn yanked her hand back with a cry. Theron slumped in his chair, his breathing ragged, his forehead slick with sweat. Marin was on her feet instantly, her hands on the king's pulse, her face tight with alarm. "What happened?" Marin demanded. Elowyn's voice came out strangled. "Someone cursed him. I saw it. During his coronation, someone placed a curse on him. Dark threads around his wolf. It was designed to suppress his ability to recognize his mate." The room went deathly silent. Marin's hands stilled on the king's wrist. She looked at Elowyn with an expression that was equal parts shock and grim confirmation. "I suspected as much," Marin said quietly. "The symptoms were too specific, too targeted to be natural deterioration, but I could not prove it." Theron's eyes opened. They were glassy, unfocused. But when they found Elowyn's face, something raw and desperate blazed behind them. "You saw it?" he rasped. "Yes." "The figure," he pressed. "Did you see who it was?" Elowyn shook her head. "They were cloaked. I could not see the face." Theron's fist slammed against the desk. The impact rattled every instrument on the surface and made Marin flinch. He pushed himself upright, his body trembling, his expression murderous. "Someone in my own territory," he said, each word bitten off and bleeding, "stood over me while I was unconscious during the most sacred rite of my kingship and cursed me." "Someone who had access to the coronation chamber," Marin confirmed, her voice low and careful. "Someone who was trusted enough to be alone with you during the ritual preparation." The implication landed like a blade between them. Not an outsider. Not an enemy kingdom. Not a rogue wolf with a grudge. Someone close. Someone still here. Theron turned to Elowyn, and the look in his eyes was no longer the clinical detachment of a king observing a test subject. It was something far more terrifying. It was fear. "You are not safe here," he said. The order came the following morning, delivered by a guard whose face betrayed nothing. She was to return to her workshop. All sessions with the king were suspended indefinitely. Her presence at the palace was no longer required. Elowyn read the formal notice twice, her hands steady, her heart splintering. She had known this was coming. The moment those words left his mouth the night before, "You are not safe here," she had seen it in his eyes. The decision had already been made. She was a liability, a target. Whoever had cursed him during the coronation had done so to keep him from finding his mate, and now that she was sitting 10 feet from him every afternoon, whoever cast that curse would know their work was being undone. She understood the logic. She even respected it. But understanding and accepting were two very different things. The walk back to her workshop felt longer than it should have. The corridors she had grown familiar with over the past 11 days felt suddenly foreign, like they were already forgetting she had ever walked them. The guards did not acknowledge her. The servants did not look up. She was invisible again. Calla was waiting for her at the workshop door, her face pinched with worry. "What happened?" "I have been dismissed," Elowyn said, and her voice came out flat and hollow. "Dismissed? Why?" Elowyn set her bag down on the workbench and stared at the rows of half-finished candles lined up on the drying rack. They looked exactly as she had left them. Nothing in this room had changed. Everything outside it had. "Because caring about me and protecting me apparently looked the same as throwing me away," she said. Calla was quiet for a moment. "So, it is about the king." "It was always about the king." Calla took her hands. Tell me what happened. All of it. So Elowen told her. Not everything. Not the curse. Not the vision. But enough. The tests. The proximity. The way his vitals changed when she was near. The way her own heartbeat seemed to synchronize with his when they sat close enough. The touch. That single moment of skin against skin that had cracked something open inside her chest that she did not know how to close. And the way he had looked at her afterward, with fear in his eyes. Not fear of her. Fear for her. Calla listened without interrupting. When Elowen finished, her friend was quiet for a long time. He sent you away because he is afraid something will hurt you, Calla said slowly. Yes. And you let him. Elowen's teeth clenched. He is the king. He is a fool, Calla said firmly. And so are you, for that matter. The first night was manageable. Elowen told herself she was fine. She made candles, she ate dinner, she went to bed and lay in the dark and counted her breaths, and tried very hard not to think about the way his skin had felt under her fingertips, the way the bond had roared to life between them like a furnace door swinging open. The second night was worse. The pull started. A physical tug behind her sternum, persistent and growing, like a fishhook buried in her ribs and attached to a line that stretched across the palace grounds to wherever he was. Her hands shook when she tried to pour wax. The flames of her own candles seemed dimmer, as though the light itself was being drawn away from her. By the third night, she could not sleep. She lay in bed with her teeth clenched, her body burning with a low-grade fever that no amount of cold water could break. Her wolf, which had been quiet her entire life, was howling. Actually howling, pacing inside her, clawing at her chest, desperate to get out, to run, to find him. She pressed her face into the pillow and cried. By the fourth morning, she could barely stand long enough to light the workshop furnace. Food tasted like ash. Water sat in her stomach like stone. Her reflection in the basin showed a woman she barely recognized, hollow-cheeked and gray-skinned, as though the color was slowly being leached from her body. She was fading. She could feel it. A slow, quiet unraveling, like a candle burning down to nothing. Across the palace, Theron was no better. Dashiell reported it in clipped, careful sentences when he visited Marin's office on the fourth day. He is not eating. He is not sleeping. His wolf has surfaced twice during council meetings. Yesterday, he shattered a mahogany table with his bare hands during a trade negotiation. And emotionally? Marin asked. He ordered me out of his study for asking that question, Dashiell replied. So, poorly. Catastrophically. Marin set down her mortar and pestle. The bond is incomplete but active. Separating them now is like pulling apart a wound that has begun to heal. It will not close on its own. It will only bleed. He will not hear it, Dashiell said. He believes she is in danger. She is in danger, Marin agreed. But so is he. And at this rate, the curse will not need to finish its work. His own stubbornness will kill him first. Meanwhile, Elowen noticed the shadow. It appeared on the fifth night. A figure at the far end of the lane, standing just beyond the reach of the lantern light. She saw it from her window when she rose to splash water on her face at midnight. It was motionless, patient, watching her workshop with the stillness of someone who had been standing there for a very long time. Elowen's blood went cold. She pressed herself against the wall beside the window, her heart hammering, and peered out from behind the curtain. The figure had not moved. She could not make out features, could not tell if they were male or female, large or small. Just a shape, just a presence, just someone who knew exactly where she was. She did not sleep that night. In the morning, the figure was gone, but the feeling lingered, a cold prickle at the base of her skull that whispered, "You are being watched." She told no one. Who would she tell? The king had cut her off. Dashiell had not visited. Marin had sent no word. She was alone in her workshop with her candles and her silence, and the growing certainty that whoever had cursed the king during the coronation was now turning their attention toward her. On the sixth night, the shadow returned. Closer this time. Alowan sat in the dark with a kitchen knife in her lap and waited for dawn. On the seventh day, Alowan collapsed. It happened in the palace courtyard, of all places. She had been delivering a crate of altar candles to the chapel, a task she had performed 100 times before, when the world tilted sideways without warning. The cobblestones rushed up to meet her. The crate hit the ground first, candles scattering like pale fingers across the stone. Then her knees buckled, and the gray sky wheeled overhead, and everything went quiet and distant and wrong. She heard voices, hands on her shoulders, someone saying her name. But the sounds were muffled, coming from very far away, and her body had become a thing made of paper and pain. Then a different sound, footsteps, running. Not the careful steps of a concerned bystander, but the heavy, desperate sprint of someone moving faster than a human body was designed to move. The crowd parted. She could feel it even with her eyes closed, the way the air shifted, the way every heartbeat in the courtyard suddenly accelerated with primal, instinctive fear. Theron dropped to his knees beside her. She felt his hands on her face, shaking, rough with panic. She felt him pull her against his chest, and a sound came out of him that was not a word. It was something older, deeper, something from the part of him that was wolf and not king. "Do not touch her," he snarled at someone who must have reached toward them, and the growl that accompanied the words shook the air like thunder. Alowan forced her eyes open. His face was inches from hers, and he looked destroyed. Not angry, not commanding, not regal. Destroyed. His gray eyes were wide and wet and wild, and his hands cradled her head like she was made of glass, and every wall he had ever built was gone. "How did you know?" she whispered. "I felt it," he said, his voice cracking. "Through the bond, like someone drove a blade through my chest." He lifted her, just gathered her up against him and stood, and the courtyard full of wolves watched their alpha king carry a chandler toward the palace like she was the most precious thing in his territory. The whispers started before they even reached the doors. Marin was waiting in the healing room. She took one look at Elowen's pallor and Theron's expression and pointed to the bed without a word. Theron set Elowen down with a gentleness that contradicted every sharp, dangerous thing about him. His hands lingered on her arms. He did not step back. 7 days, Marin said, her voice flat with controlled anger. "I told you this would happen." "Not now," Theron warned. "Yes, now," Marin snapped. And the fact that she snapped at the Alpha King with the same energy she might use on a disobedient apprentice said everything about how serious this was. Her vitals are crashing. Her wolf is in distress. The incomplete bond is tearing her apart from the inside. Another week and it would have been irreversible. Theron flinched like he had been struck. "And you," Marin continued, rounding on him, "are not much better. You have lost 9 pounds. Your wolf has been surfacing involuntarily. Your cortisol levels could fell a horse. You are killing yourself and you are killing her, and you are doing it in the name of protection." The king said nothing. His hand found Elowen's and wrapped around it, and she felt the bond flare between them, desperate and aching and alive. "There is something else," Elowen said, her voice thin but steady. They both turned to her. "Someone has been watching my workshop. A figure at night. They have come twice. They stand in the dark and they watch." The temperature in the room dropped. Theron's grip on her hand tightened to the point of pain. "When?" he demanded. "The 5th and 6th nights after you sent me away." Something terrible moved behind his eyes. Guilt, fury, and a cold, lethal calculation that reminded her exactly who this man was and what he was capable of. "You sent her away," Marin said quietly. "And whoever cursed you found her unprotected." "I know," Theron said, and the two words contained more self-loathing than Elowyn had ever heard from a single human throat. "Then you know what needs to happen," Marin replied. The silence stretched. Elowyn watched his face, the war behind his eyes, the moment when something inside him surrendered. "Elowyn," he said, and it was the first time he had ever used her first name. The sound of it in his voice, low and rough and broken, made her eyes fill with tears. "Do not send me away again," she whispered. "Please." "I will not. Promise me." He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips against her knuckles, his eyes closing. "I promise." "Sending me away does not protect me," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "It just means I suffer alone instead of beside you. And I would rather face whatever is coming together than survive another week of that silence." Theron opened his eyes. The rawness in them was staggering. "I have spent 3 years unable to see you," he said. "And now I cannot close my eyes without your face. I cannot breathe without reaching for you. I cannot exist in a room you are not in without feeling like the walls are closing in." He paused, his throat working. "I am not a man built for gentle words. But you should know that sending you away was the hardest thing I have ever done. Harder than any war. Harder than any kingship. And I will never do it again." Elowyn pulled him toward her. He came willingly, his forehead pressing against hers, their breaths mingling in the small space between them. "Then stay," she said. He kissed her. It was not gentle. It was 3 years of blindness and 7 days of agony, and a lifetime of loneliness compressed into a single, searing point of contact. His hands cradled her face, and hers fisted in his shirt, and the bond between them blazed so bright she could feel it burning behind her closed eyes. When they broke apart breathing hard, he pressed his mouth to her neck. She felt his teeth graze her skin, felt the question in the hesitation. "Yes," she whispered. The mating bite was fire and lightning and the sound of a lock finally turning. The bond snapped into place with a force that stole her breath. Golden and fierce and permanent, connecting them at a depth that went beyond flesh, beyond thought, beyond anything she had words for. She bit him back, marked him as hers, felt him shudder beneath her claim, and his arms tighten around her like he intended to hold on for the rest of his natural life. The bond settled between them, warm and humming and complete. For a long moment, they just held each other, his face buried in her hair, her hand pressed against his heartbeat. The world outside the healing room ceased to exist. Then Marin cleared her throat from the doorway. "I hate to interrupt," she said, not sounding particularly sorry. "But while you two were busy, I finished tracing the curse signature." They both turned to look at her. "The magic used on you during the coronation," Marin continued, her expression grave, "matches a very specific school of blood sorcery. Only 3 practitioners in Ashenmoor's recorded history have been capable of it." She paused, her gaze flicking between them. 2 of them have been dead for over a century. The third is very much alive. She let the words land. And she has been living inside this palace for the past 4 years. The golden warmth of the bond flickered. Elowyn felt Theron go rigid beside her, felt the surge of cold fury flooding through their connection, and knew with absolute certainty that the most dangerous part of this story had not yet begun. Her name was Revka, Lady Revka Ashgrove, court ritualist, keeper of the sacred rites, the woman who had prepared the coronation chamber and who had stood over Theron's unconscious body during the anointing ceremony while every other soul was cleared from the room. Marin laid the evidence out with the precise, merciless efficiency of a healer performing surgery. The curse signature, the blood sorcery lineage, the access, the motive, the timeline. Every piece fit together like bones reassembled after a break, forming a picture so complete that denial was impossible. Theron listened in silence, his face carved from stone. Elowen could feel him through the bond, a roiling darkness barely held in check. Fury and betrayal braided together so tightly she could not tell where one ended and the other began. "Bring her," Theron said when Marin finished. Dashiell did not hesitate. They waited in the king's study, the same room where Elowen had once sat in a leather chair braiding wicks while the king pretended she was not there. It felt like a lifetime ago. When the doors opened and Revka entered, Elowen recognized her immediately, not because they had ever spoken, but because she had seen her at every ball since the coronation. A tall woman with silver-streaked hair and sharp, elegant features, always positioned near the king's left shoulder, always watching the room with an expression of calm authority. Elowen had never thought twice about her, but then, she had never thought twice about anyone who stood near the king. They all blurred together in the golden light, part of a world she was never meant to touch. Revka's gaze swept the room, registering the king, the beta, the healer, and finally, Elowen. When her eyes landed on Elowen, something flickered across her face. Not surprise, recognition. The cold, assessing recognition of someone encountering a problem they had believed was already solved. "You know why you are here," Theron said. It was not a question. Revka studied him for a long moment, her posture straight, her hands folded before her. Then she sighed, and the sound was almost weary. "I suppose the girl touched you," she said. Theron's growl shook the walls. 3 years, he said, rising from behind the desk, his voice low and lethal. "You stood beside me for 3 years. You attended every council meeting. You blessed every harvest. You performed the rites at every gathering. And the entire time, you were the reason I was dying." "You were not dying," Revka corrected, her voice steady. "You were being preserved." The silence that followed was absolute. "Preserved," Theron repeated, the word dripping with venom. Revka met his gaze without flinching. A mated alpha is a compromised alpha. History proves it. Every king who bonded, every ruler who gave his heart to a mate, weakened. They hesitated. They prioritized one life over many. They made decisions with their bond instead of their judgment. She lifted her chin. Ashenmore needed a strong king, an unattached king. I gave you that. "You gave me 3 years of sleepless nights," Theron snarled. 3 years of my wolf tearing itself apart. 3 years of a bond screaming for a woman I could not see. "Sacrifices," Revka said, "for the greater good of the pack." Elowen stepped forward. She did not plan it. Her body simply moved, drawn by a question that had been lodged in her throat since the moment Revka's name was spoken. "You said the girl," Elowen said quietly. "You recognized me." "How?" Revka's expression shifted just slightly. A tightening around the mouth that might have been discomfort, or might have been contempt. "I have always known who you are," Revka said. "The curse required it. To sever the bond at its root, I needed to identify both ends of the thread. I found you when you were 17, a foundling chandler with no family, no rank, no name worth remembering." Her gaze hardened. "Do you know how easy it is to make someone invisible when they are already halfway there?" The words hit Elowen like a physical blow. "What do you mean?" she whispered. "Small adjustments," Revka continued, her tone almost clinical. "A word here, a suggestion there, making sure you were never promoted, never recognized, never moved to a position where you might cross the king's path in any meaningful way. The curse blinded him, but I made certain there was nothing for him to see, even if it failed." Elowen's vision blurred. 3 years. 3 years of standing against walls and being overlooked, of telling herself she was simply the kind of person who did not get noticed, of building an identity around her own invisibility because she believed it was the truth of who she was. And it had been manufactured, engineered, imposed on her by a woman who had decided she was not important enough to exist fully. "You made me disappear," Elowen said, her voice shaking. "Not just from him. From everyone." "You were never meant to matter," Revka replied. "Not to him, not to anyone. You were a loose thread, and I tucked you away where you could not unravel anything important." Something inside Elowen broke, not the fragile, wounded part she had protected her entire life. Something harder, something that had been holding her down, keeping her small, whispering that she did not deserve to take up space. It shattered, and in its place was a fury so clean and bright it burned. "You are wrong," Elowen said, and her voice was no longer shaking. "I was always meant to matter. You just made sure I did not know it." She turned to Theron. His eyes were already on her, blazing with something fierce and proud and aching. "Break the curse," Elowen said to Marin, without looking away from him. "The bond has already weakened it significantly," Marin replied. "But to shatter it completely, the king must reject the premise the curse was built on. He must choose his mate openly, fully, in defiance of everything the curse was designed to prevent." Theron crossed the room in 3 strides. He took Elowen's face in his hands, tilting it up toward his, and the tenderness in the gesture was devastating because it came from a man who had never been gentle with anything in his life. "I choose you," he said. "Not because you fix me, not because you are my cure or my remedy or my medicine, because you are the bravest, sharpest, most stubbornly magnificent woman I have ever known, and I was a fool for 3 years, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure you are never invisible again." The curse shattered. Elowen felt it go, a sound like glass breaking in a cathedral, resonating through the bond and through the room, and through the marrow of her bones. The dark threads she had seen in her vision, the ones wrapped around his wolf-like chains, disintegrated into ash and light. Theron staggered. His wolf surged forward, free for the first time in 3 years, and the howl that tore from his chest was not a sound of war or dominance. It was relief. Pure, devastating, soul-deep relief. Revka was taken by the guards. She did not struggle. She walked out of the study with the same composed posture she had always carried, and Elowen watched her go and felt nothing but the fierce, quiet satisfaction of a woman who had finally stopped apologizing for existing. Theron's arms wrapped around her from behind. She leaned back into him, feeling his heartbeat against her spine, steady and strong. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" he murmured against her hair. "For seeing me." His arms tightened. "I will never stop." The winter ball was the largest Ashenmore had seen in a decade. The great hall blazed with candlelight, hundreds of tapers and iron chandeliers overhead, every one of them made by the queen's own hands. Elowen had insisted on that. She was queen now, bonded and crowned and recognized, but she had not stopped making candles. She never would. It was not who she had been forced to be, it was who she chose to be. Theron stood at the head of the hall, one hand resting on the small of her back, his thumb tracing absent patterns against the silk of her gown. He was talking to an ambassador about grain tariffs, and he was doing it while maintaining constant physical contact with his mate, and Elowen found this both ridiculous and deeply endearing. He slept now. Every night, peacefully, deeply, his body curled around hers like she was the only safe place in the world. Sometimes he still woke in the dark, reaching for her with hands that expected emptiness, but she was always there. She watched the ballroom, the dancers, the candlelight, the hundreds of wolves in their finery. She had stood in this room so many times, pressed against the back wall, invisible, aching, watching a life she believed she could never touch. Theron leaned down, his lips brushing her ear. "You are staring at the crowd," he murmured. "I am remembering," she said. "Remembering what?" She turned to look at him, at the face she had watched from across this room for 3 years, and smiled. Standing against the wall. His gray eyes softened. He took her hand and lifted it, pressing his lips to her knuckles in full view of the entire court. "Never again," he said. The music swelled, the candles burned, and the woman who had once been invisible danced with her king in the center of the room, exactly where she belonged.